Isn't that a great story about the ant farmers from my colleague, Reverend Jamie Henson Rieger? I'm going to be talking a little bit a lot in my sermon this morning about fungus as a inspirational example about how we cultivate relationship with one another and with the natural world. First, I want to share this grounding reading with you all. This comes from Marge Piercy, one of my favorite poems. It's a touchstone for me. The Seven of Pentacles. Under a sky the color of pea soup, she is looking at her work growing away there actively, thickly like grapevines or pole beans, as things grow in the real world, slowly enough. If you tend them properly, if you mulch, if you water, if you provide birds that eat insects a home and winter food, if the sun shines and you pick off caterpillars, if the praying mantis comes and the ladybugs and the bees, then the plants flourish, but at their own internal clock. Connections are made slowly. Sometimes they grow underground. You cannot tell always by looking what is happening. More than half the tree is spread out in the soil under your feet. Penetrate quietly as the earthworm that blows no trumpet. Fight persistently as the creeper that brings down the tree. Spread like the squash plant that overruns the garden. Gnaw in the dark and use the sun to make sugar. Weave real connections. Create real nodes. Build real houses. Live a life you can endure. Make love that is loving. Keep tangling and interweaving and taking more in. A thicket and bramble wilderness to the outside, but to us interconnected with rabbit runs and burrows and lairs. Live as if you liked yourself, and it may happen. Reach out. Keep reaching out. Keep bringing in. This is how we are going to live for a long time. Not always. For every gardener knows that after the digging, after the planting, after the long season of tending and growth, the harvest comes. Mushrooms seem to be having a moment this fall. My partner swears she has seen more fungus fruiting in our neighborhood this fall than any other year. But I don't know if that's really true or not, or if it's a case of noticing more of something simply because we are paying more attention. I don't know if you all had this experience this spring of 2020 when things shut down because of the pandemic, but it felt like the longest, most beautiful spring. It was a mild spring and the flowers seemed incredible. And I remember in conversation with some of you wondering, is it actually the longest, most beautiful spring? Or are we able to pay more attention to the beauty around us because of this collective shutting down that we were going through? One of my garden beds is built where a few years ago there stood a very large pin oak tree. And the wood of its underground roots is still decomposing. If I dig deep enough, I can hit the remains of the stump and the roots under the earth. And that may be one of the reasons why there seems to be a continued abundance of fungus in that area, which is maybe not so great for my tomatoes in the space of one season. But taking a longer view is part of turning the soil there into rich nutrients that hopefully my garden will benefit from over time. Fungi are prodigious decomposers, says biologist Merlin Sheldrake in his recent book entitled Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our World, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. I have it right here. He says, quote, "We live and breathe in the space that decomposition leaves behind." I want y'all to think about that for a minute. We live and breathe in the space that decomposition leaves behind. The mushrooms that we see, especially this time of year above the ground, are just the fruiting bodies of much vaster networks of fungus underground. And after reading this book by Merlin Sheldrake, I do now look for and see and imagine more frequently the fungus that is among us. How much we depend on unseen forces for the air we breathe and the food we eat. The little parasol-shaped mushrooms that came up in front of my house a few weeks ago are just little reminders of my own dependence on and interdependence with other species. Now, one of the most powerful things I think Sheldrake explores in this book is the various ways fungi engage in symbiotic relationships. There's the relationship with farming insects like the leafcutter ants in the story we just heard. And there's a kind of termite in Africa that also has a similar kind of farming symbiotic relationship with fungus. There's the deeply symbiotic relationship between fungus and algae that creates what we call lichen. And he talks about the symbiotic relationships that fungus have with plants. This relationship on which all life, including human life, depends. In fact, it's pretty clear to scientists, biologists, evolutionary biologists, that in the history of evolution, fungus was the key to life moving out of the water and onto the land. A relationship developed between algae and fungus that benefited both, and that eventually led to what we now call roots. Algae could photosynthesize, turn carbon into an energy source, and fungus could access water and minerals in the ground. They began to feed each other, and eventually roots evolved, which are actually part plant and part fungus most of the time. Sheldrake writes, mycorrhizal fungi, the kind of fungi that live in the symbiotic relationship with plants, mycorrhizal fungi are the roots of all life on land. He goes on to say, today, more than 90% of all plant species depend on mycorrhizal fungi. They are the rule, not the exception. A more fundamental part of planthood than fruit, flowers, leaves, wood, or even roots. Out of this intimate partnership, he says, which is complete with cooperation, conflict, and competition, plants and mycorrhizal fungi enact a collective flourishing that underpins our past, present, and future. We are unthinkable without them, yet seldom do we think about them. Plants and their mycorrhizal fungi remain separate organisms, but they are utterly interdependent with each other as we are on them. They are an example of, quote, the ancient tendency for organisms to associate. In fact, some anthropologists and biologists use the term involution instead of evolution to describe the development of life on planet Earth. Instead of some linear branching line of species-specific development, kind of a branching out and separating more and more, a kind of progress upward and onward. The word involution points to the crucial role that interspecies involvement and relationship and mutually beneficial interaction has played in the incredible story of life on our planet. Sheldrake writes, involution is ongoing and extravagant. By associating with one another, all participants wander outside and beyond their prior limits. Just think about that for a minute. We all, I think, can connect with that, even in our own life experience, how being associated with another being, a human being, an animal being, a plant being, a tree, can sometimes help us wander outside and beyond our prior limits. We, as Unitarian Universalists, affirm the interdependence of all life as one of our central principles. It is core to our worldview. It is a significant part of our religious and spiritual offering that none of us are isolated individuals, but made in and through relationship. Now, this worldview is certainly not unique to us, but in the context of the sort of Western capitalist cult of the individual, it is certainly a subversive worldview. Principle number 7 of the Unitarian Universalist Association is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I say these words frequently or some variation of them, and yet it is entirely another endeavor in our culture to truly live as if it were true, to remember each day, each moment, that my life is utterly dependent on the lives of others. Yes, each one of you, and also the untold species that we rarely think about. Yesterday, I spent time in my garden. I picked the last eggplant. I finally got some eggplant. It took a while. And I picked the last green tomatoes. I just can't bear to not do something with them. And I pulled out the tomato plants and added them to the compost pile, although I left a couple in hopes that I might still get some ripe ones. And for the first time ever, I am trying out planting some fava beans or broad beans over the winter, hoping they'll grow over the winter because they like cold weather. It might be a bit too late in the season. I might have waited too long to get the seeds in the ground, but we'll see. But I took a little extra time to inoculate the seeds with a special bacteria. So not a fungus, but a bacteria. And it's a dust, really. Inoculating the seeds, basically just coating the seeds with this dust that contains a special bacteria, gives an extra boost to another special symbiotic relationship that we often don't think about unless we're organic farmers. The bacteria, like mycorrhizal fungi, takes up residence in the roots of the plants. This is the kind of bacteria that takes nitrogen from the air and fixes it. It's called fixing nitrogen, fixes it so that it is accessible as a nutrient to plants in the soil. Now, the hope from my perspective is that all that good nitrogen in the soil makes my garden, especially the tomatoes, even better next year. And aside from that self-interest, I can also just stand in awe at this example of an amazing, delicate system of mutual aid and mutual flourishing. It is a spiritual practice to pay attention to the miracle it is that life exists at all, and that we get to be a part of it. It is a spiritual practice to pause and to look for and to feel more deeply the interconnections. And it is a religious impulse that leads us to respond to that miracle of life with wonder, with gratitude, and with reverence and care. So in this season of autumn, the season of the mushroom, let's seek out the signs of life unseen, underground and in the air, as reminders of our utterly dependent place in the web of life. I invite us all to pay really close attention this fall. And in this time of unraveling and unhinging of many systems, economic systems, political systems, ecological systems, let's find possibility for ourselves in the story of the billions of years of persistent life on this planet, finding ways through and in relationship, like the algae and the fungus, to turn what was once desolate into the cradle of new life. As our opening words by Margaret Kuyp reminded us, as surely as we belong to the universe, we belong together. We join here to transcend the isolated self, to reconnect, to know ourselves to be at home, here on earth, under the stars, linked with each other. May we know this ever more deeply. May it be so, and amen.